Hi. So, before I start talking about the major film theories in circulation today, let us continue with our talk about the major film movements. You may recall that we have been talking about French New Wave. So, as important a movement as French New Wave has been the Italian Neorealism movement, which started in Italy. Neorealism generally refers to films of working class life set in abysmal poverty. This aesthetic movement tapped into a particular transition in Italian life and became a vehicle for filmmakers interested in vivid description of history and society. The underlying message in the films of this movement is that in a better society, wealth would be more evenly distributed. In the late 1940s, neorealism's influence spread to Hollywood and filmmakers started using tropes such as actual locations, filming on actual locations, where city became an important character, and filmmakers also used long takes to bring about a touch of verisimilitude or true to life, in addition to using non-professional actors who added truthfulness or veracity to the films. By non-professional actors, we mean people who have not been actively involved in the business or in the art of acting. So, the neorealist movement spread to the other parts of the world also. In India, we have Satyajit Ray, who made films which are very similar to the Italian neorealist cinema, Akira Kurosawa in Japan, and then also directors in Germany, Spain and Eastern Europe were influenced by this movement. The major Italian neorealists were Roberto Rossellini and Vittorio De Sica. Now, Roberto Rossellini, who lived between 1906 to 1977, was named the father of modern film by Cahiers du Cinema writers. Along with Jean Renoir, he was the most influential name among the international filmmakers. It was Open City Rome, which is regarded as one of the first major works of Italian neorealism, which cemented his position. The film weaves together a variety of stories of Romans during the occupation of Italy by the German forces. It was shot true to the dictates of or the tenets of neorealism. It was shot on locations with non-professional actors. Again, Vittorio De Sica's The Bicycle Thieves is commonly regarded as the film that heralded Italian neorealism, and I suggest at this point that you watch some of the films made by Rossellini and De Sica. Let us move on to now talk about intertextuality. So, these are the major areas that I will be touching upon: intertextuality, ideology and semiotics, and how they are related to film theories. So, these are basically literary concepts which have also come into currency in film studies. So, intertextuality, introduced by Julia Kristeva, is commonly it is defined as shaping of one text by other texts. According to Kristeva, the meaning we find in a text is not to be located in its relationship to the mind in which it seems to have originated, but in its relationship to other texts. So, it is important that when we do intertextuality, we understand how a particular text is related to other texts. There is another important name that you should be familiar with, that is the Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin, who according to him all human communication are dialogic and heteroglossic. That means every utterance is a contribution to an ongoing dialogue, which means every word reflects what has gone before. For Kristeva, any text is constructed of a mosaic of quotations. That means it refers to something else. Any text is the absorption and transformation of another. So, a text is not simply a text by itself, but it is a mosaic of quotations. It alludes to several other texts. Cinema is dialogic as films refer to other films and texts. Films are read in the light of their resemblance to other films and texts and tap into a shared cultural heritage. Films feed on pre-existing materials and expressive forms. We have to notice that intertextuality is not plagiarism, but a quotation, an allusion, a citation appealing to the knowledge of the educated audience who have, by educated audience I mean those who are cinematically literate. So, this is something that you should know, cinematically literate audience and visually literate audience. So, let us talk about cinema and ideology. How does ideology permeate through several works of art? So, it is not just literature, it is not just art, but it is also cinema that reflects ideology. A film, as we know, is a sum total of the maker's attitudes, beliefs, which include political and social and also cultural positions. Ideology can be visible or deeply embedded and thus appear natural. Sometimes filmmakers are overtly ideological, they take a strong political or ethical position. Okay, for example, a classic example is the Russian filmmakers, for example, Battleship Potemkin. Okay, so, it is an overtly socialist kind of an ideology. Most of the time ideologies are deeply embedded, okay, they are covert, but they are still there. So, the premise is, the basic idea is that there is nothing, there is no text which is completely clear of an ideological position. More often than not, filmmakers have to identify a position which could be overt, explicit or implicit, and that becomes the ideology of the film. Films, especially commercial films and particularly the blockbuster kind of film, they cater to the dominant prevailing ideology of the society, and for this you have to be very sensitive to the films that you watch, and therefore, the term that we give is, or we use, is visual literacy. Okay. Through several acts of or through several cinematic devices, a director draws our attention to the position that he has taken in the film, and that is what we refer to as ideology. So, an ideology is commonly explained as a systematic body of ideas, attitudes, values and perceptions. Ideology is also the collective views, attitudes, position and dogmas of a societal group. Ideology can be seen or unseen, conscious or unconscious, and is determined by time and place. This is important. An ideology is determined by the time the text is set in and also the place the text is set in. Now, these are complex issues, and these if you take a course, for example, a film appreciation or a full-fledged course in film theory, then you might get a better understanding of this. So, coming back to Eisenstein and his Battleship Potemkin, the movie which made him world famous, released in 1925. It is one of the most influential texts, a point of ideological conflict between the East and the West, between the working class and the ruling class. So, even his aesthetic sensibility was imbued with political vision. So, in the film, Eisenstein's aesthetic sensibility was imbued with his political vision, and the legendary Odessa step scene contains his vision of oppression, rebellion and collective action. Ideology provides identities and gives us a subject position, and it is very clear, very well brought out in the Odessa step scene in Battleship Potemkin. Louis Althusser is a prominent name associated with ideology, and he has written a famous essay called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, published in 1969. Here he seeks to describe ways in which the state exerts its power outside such institutions as the army, the courts, the police, etc., which is to say in culture and society generally. The central insight of this essay is that ideology is bound up with the constitution of the subject, that man is an ideological animal by nature, meaning that people constitute or define themselves as humans through ideology. As Althusser argues, ideology hails or interpellates concrete individuals as concrete subjects. It calls us or calls to us as subjects, and we recognize ourselves as a subject, then is an effect of ideology. This was also the time when scholars incorporated Althusser's writings with Lacan's psychoanalysis and the writings that followed. Lacan's mirror stage became a frequently resorted concept in film studies. In his 1970 essay which appeared in Cinethic called Ideological Effects of the Basic Cinematic Apparatus, Jean-Louis Baudry, the French critic, he developed the mirror analogy as a way of revisiting perspective in cinema and its ideological implications. Baudry observes that through the adoption of greater realism, more secular subject matter and an increasingly marked individualism of style, art has conditioned the perspectives of the general spectators. Moreover, the system of perspective based on indicating a single unique vantage point in the imaginary space outside of the work from which content was perceived supports an individualistic bourgeois subject position. This historical investigation or interpretation of perspective gets adapted to theories of the cinematic apparatus by offering the film spectator an omniscient unitary point of view, thus reinforcing the bourgeois notion of subject as a free individual. This subject effect produced by the cinema became a topic of extensive debate framed under the title apparatus theory in the writings of Stephen Heath, Teresa de Lauretis and Christian Metz. I will also talk about genre theory. Genre theory and criticism attempts to legitimate the very popular nature of film. Genre, as we understand, are categories. Simplistically put, they are categories to which a work of art may belong. So, genres are used by filmmakers to legitimate the popular nature of film, especially as a product of the Hollywood studio system. In India too, we have the genre system, we have action and comedy and romance and such kinds of genres and categories. And to identify the similar items and elements in a group of works by different directors. Apart from the works of individual directors, genre theory also attempts to explain the social and cultural needs of the viewers of a particular era. Genre theory and criticism was useful for adopting the emphasis on structuralism, which had a profound effect on cultural criticism during the late 1960s and the 70s. This was the period when Hollywood offered a large number of similar films with similar elements in each genre, the western, the gangster, the epic, etc., which made these films popular. There is a book called Horizon West by Jim Kitsis, which establishes a basic structural and thematic argument in the Western and also shows the individual contribution of specific directors in this field. Peter Wollen also discusses Howard Hawks and John Ford films in Signs and Meanings in the Cinema, and also uses genres in author structuralist approach to develop thematic structures and tensions in the films of these two directors. Again, Christian Metz in Film Language, a Semiotics of Cinema, illustrates the way films signify meaning through semiotic codes, especially specialized codes unique to the cinema, such as the 8 arrangements of shots possible in a narrative sequence. So, we are not now talking about how genres get informed by semiotic theory. Okay. There is also a seminal book by Noel Carroll and David Bordwell called Post Theory, Reconstructing Film Studies, published in 1996, where the editors follow a neo-formalist approach, and the approach deals with the idea of defamiliarization. The book also reflects on the grand theories that had come to dominate cinema studies through the 1960s and 70s, most especially semiotics, cultural studies and psychoanalysis. So, Carroll and Bordwell famously use the word or the term slap theory to refer to the theories that use the ideas of Saussure, Lacan, Althusser and Barthes, that is Roland Barthes. So, therefore, slap theories, Saussure, Lacan, Althusser, Barthes. An important feature of film criticism is that psychoanalytic theory has continued to be revisited and re-examined in important ways. So, psychoanalytic theory often emerges and often comes into play as we as students of cinema, as students of literary theory watch films, and there are points where psychoanalytic criticism becomes extremely visible. There are two more important theorists. One is Deleuze. So, Gilles Deleuze, who has written Cinema 1 and Cinema 2. So, Cinema 1 deals with movement and image, and the Cinema 2, the second volume, deals with the time and image. So, they are appropriately titled as Cinema 1 the movement image and Cinema 2 the time image. Deleuze often writes his books, and he has propounded several important theories along with Guattari. So, in Deleuze we find echoes from the writings of Henri Bergson and Charles Peirce for a theoretical and philosophical study of the dominance of the movement image in classical cinema. Coming to semiotics, semiotics as a film discourse received considerable impetus from the politicization of theory and criticism from the late 1960s onwards in the French journal Cinétique and also Cahiers du Cinéma, and in British publication Screen. Termed as the second semiotics, it is based upon a combination of semiotics, Marxism as proposed by Althusser, and Lacan's theories, mirror image, and also theories which are interested and informed by post-Freudianism. So, these discourses eventually became a strong force among a group of film teachers at American universities and in the professional journals for which they wrote. The central concern of the second semiotics was to identify and then deconstruct the ideological structures and codes of society implied in narrative cinema, and also to align this ideological focus with Lacan's psychoanalytic theory about the child's early developmental stage, especially the mirrored stage, to which we regress on some level when viewing the images on the screen. Another important theory is narratology, and we will see how it is important to cinema. So, one of the most famous film theoreticians in recent times is David Bordwell, and in 1985 he published Narration in the Fiction Film, in which he develops a narrative theory that reflects on the spectator's perception and cognition. In addition to employing a theory of psychology, Bordwell also draws on the literary theory of Russian formalism, especially the notions of sujet and fabula. Continuing with the theory of narratology, Edward Brannigan's point of view in the cinema, a theory of narration and subjectivity in classical film, often uses the vocabulary and concepts of literary narratology to discuss film narrative texts. The last part of this lecture focuses on postmodernism and film theory. Postmodernism is also concerned with the fragmentation and lack of cohesion in both cultural and individual identity, the subversion of time and history, and the domination of the world by media and information technology, in which we have created a reality of signs and images for us. So, most significant works in this discussion are Guy Debord's seminal The Society of the Spectacle, and also the works of Jean Baudrillard, especially his Simulations, and also Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. The concepts of postmodernism has been useful so far in the analysis of a number of films and in understanding certain tendencies in modern cinema. For example, you have to understand Jameson's concept of pastiche, the imitation and accumulation of the filmic codes of the past, and this has been especially useful. Recent anthologies on film theory attempts to show the diversity of the field. Some of the recent important books on film studies are A Companion to Film Theory and Film and Theory, an anthology, both co-edited by Toby Miller and Robert Stamp. A Companion to Film Theory incorporates authors from diverse backgrounds that crisscross cinema studies and literature, communication, anthropology, philosophy, sociology and education. So, the idea here is that film studies is informed by a variety of disciplines. And as Miller states, the authors come from 5 continents as part of our desire to push the field further toward deprovincialization. So, this is what I have to say about film theory, and let me draw your attention to the bibliography for this particular area. So, Andre Beson's What is Cinema? This is seminal classic text. Leo Braudy and Marshall Cohen's Film Theory and Criticism, and Susan Hayward's Key Concepts in Cinema Studies. Thank you very much.